When we do word problems, we have to make sure that we read the whole problem. The first step is going to be to define our variables. So when we read through this problem, we want to focus in on the sentence that will tell us what our variables are. So let's take a look at the problem. It says one serving of tomato soup contains 100 calories and 18 grams of carbohydrates. One slice of whole wheat bread contains 70 calories and 13 grams of carbohydrates. How many servings of each would be required to obtain 230 calories and 42 grams of carbohydrates? The main mistake that's made in this problem is that people focus on calories and carbohydrates and don't focus on servings. If you read the very last sentence, the sentence usually with the question will define the variables. This sentence says how many servings of each would be required to obtain 230 calories and 42 grams of carbohydrates. The part that says how many servings of each is the part that asks you for some information. Well, what are we talking about? Servings of what? So we need to go back through our problem and see what we're actually serving. It says in the problem that we're talking about tomato soup. And let's see, what else are we talking about? If we read the rest of the problem, we can see that we're talking about tomato soup and whole wheat bread. So when the problem says how many servings of each, we're talking about how many servings of tomato soup and how many servings of whole wheat bread. So those are our variables. We have two of them because we are talking about two items. So we need to define our variables. That's the very first step. Once we define our variables, we can start writing equations. So we have an x and a y variable, servings of tomato soup, servings of whole wheat bread. The problem wants to know how many servings of each would be required to obtain 230 calories and 42 grams of carbohydrates. So we need to start looking through the problem and see what the problem says about calories and what the problem says about carbohydrates. If I start looking through that problem, I can find a couple things about calories. It often helps in a case like this to go through the problem and see what we have that is a total. We actually have a total of 230 calories and we have a total of 42 grams of carbohydrates. So when we look through the problem, and you can see that I've circled some things in red, I have circled the total for the calories and I have circled everything else in that problem that talks about calories so that we can see if this makes any sense. I know that I have 100 calories in tomato soup and 70 calories in whole wheat bread, and I'm supposed to have 230 calories altogether. So if I add those two things together, I should get a total of 230 calories. The problem is I don't know how many servings of tomato soup I've got or how many servings of whole wheat bread I've got. That's what they've asked me for. So I could probably write an equation that would give me that information. I've written an equation that just talks about calories, but it's in terms of tomato soup and whole wheat bread. Every equation that you write must have all of the variables that you're talking about in it. So if we're talking about calories, we have to talk about tomato soup calories and whole wheat bread calories. So now we look through the problem and let's see what else it talks about. Looks like it talks about carbohydrates. So let's see if we have a total for carbohydrates. And we do. You can see I've circled that in green. We have 42 grams that we're allowed in carbohydrates. Now I'm going to have soup and I'm going to have whole wheat bread. I have something that tells me how many carbohydrates I have in the soup. And I have something that tells me how many carbohydrates I have in the bread. And I have a total. So we can write another equation that would represent the carbohydrates of the soup and the bread. Now I want you to think about these two equations. Let's just take some for instances here. Let's say I had 2 servings of soup. And if it's 100 calories for each serving, I would say 100 times 2, and that would mean that I would have used 200 calories for my soup. So we're multiplying. If we wanted to find out how much we were actually using, we would be multiplying. That's why in my equations I have 100 times x because I don't know how many servings I have, and 70 times y because I don't know how many servings of whole wheat bread that I have. So that's why the multiplication is represented in the equations. Now we have those two equations. We have no other information in our problem. So we have everything that we need to be able to solve for this problem. This is exactly the kind of equation that you've been doing in previous sections using substitution or elimination. For that matter, you could even put it in your calculator if you wanted to and graph it. It doesn't matter how many variables you have or how many equations you have. Once you get them set up, you look at them and see what kind of problem they are, and then you solve them exactly the same way you would as if it hadn't been a word problem. If I look at this one, I see two variables, two equations. I would probably want to do elimination with this one. In order to eliminate, remember we need to have opposite signs. So I'm going to have to look at those and see if I can come up with something that I can have opposite signs. I think I'm going to focus on the y's because they're smaller numbers. 13, if I multiply 13 times 5, that would give me 65. So there's no way that I'm going to get a 70. However, if I took this top row and I multiplied it by 13, and I took the bottom row and multiplied it by 70, I would have a number that they have in common. It would be like using a common denominator. This figure would be 910. I just need to make sure that I change one of the row's signs in order to get them to eliminate. So I'm going to change the top row. As you can see, all I've done is multiplied the top row actually by negative 13 because I decided to change the signs on that one. So I multiplied that row by negative 13 and I multiplied the bottom row by 70. And now you can see my numbers. I'm just going to combine them. You can see that the y's eliminate. And when I do my math, I get that x is equal to 1.25. So we defined x as the servings of tomato soup, so I could have 1 1/4 servings of tomato soup. I would need to go back up to one of my original equations and see how many servings of whole wheat bread I would need to be able to have. I've substituted 1.25 in for 100. I do my math and get y by itself. And according to my math, I can have 1 1/2 servings of whole wheat bread if I want to stick to the parameters that I've been given for my calories and for my carbohydrates.